I'm Ron Duncan Hart. Welcome those of you who have joined this Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series with Professor Geoffrey West. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Bonnie Ellinger, who will do the introduction for Professor West. Bonnie.
Thank you very much, Ron. Geoffrey West is the Shannon Distinguished Professor and former president of the Santa Fe Institute and an Associate Senior Fellow of Oxford University's Green Templeton College. West is a theoretical physicist whose primary interests have been in fundamental questions ranging across physics, biology, and the social sciences, motivated by the search for unifying principles and the simplicity underlying complexity. His research includes metabolism, growth, aging and death, sleep, cancer, ecosystems, rates of growth and innovation, and the accelerating pace of life. Most recently, he has been developing a science of cities and companies, including the challenge of long-term global sustainability. West has lectured at many high-profile events, including TED and Davos. He has received many awards, and his work has been featured in numerous publications, podcasts, and TV productions. He is the author of the best-selling Scale, the Universal Laws of Growth, Innovation, Sustainability, and the Pace of Life in Organisms, Cities, Economies, and Companies. And he was named to Time Magazine's list of the 100 most influential people in the world in 2000, emphasis on world, in 2007. It is with great pleasure that we welcome Professor West to the Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series.
Thank you, Bonnie, for that slightly embarrassing introduction.
Not to us.
Well, for me. But thank you very much, and for underwriting this. Very much appreciated. And thank you, Ron, for inviting me. I'm absolutely delighted and flattered to be able to give this talk. And given that introduction, I hope I don't disappoint. So with that, let me share screen. Is that seen? Yes, good. Okay, well, this is this grandiose and slightly pretentious title that I've given, which covers an extraordinarily broad territory and in some ways allows me to talk about almost anything. But I am going to lead up to sort of big conceptual questions about the future of the planet and in terms of our long-term sustainability. And I'm going to cover, as I say, a very broad territory, and a lot of it, you know, underlying it is a lot of technical stuff and a lot of mathematics and so on and so forth. Obviously, none of that will I touch. So it's going to be like this picture from sort of 100,000 foot, sort of coarse-grained and low resolution, very impressionistic. But I want to get some of the ideas across, and in particular, some of the extraordinary interconnections and interrelatedness among many different things that may seemingly be disparate. So let's talk about the planet to begin with. So when you think of the planet, our world, our globe, it is that, you know, this sort of image is what you immediately may think of. But of course, what it really is much more like this. It's sprouting all this stuff. And this stuff is us, our influence on the planet, and especially in the last couple of 100 years. But we've had an enormous effect, and so much so that I'm sure many of you know that this age, so to speak, has been dubbed the the Anthropocene. I hope you can see that. I'm having a little problem with the screen, but there it is. There. Let me go back. I'm sorry. There's that. Yeah. do apologize, but let me go back to this. Yeah, I'm just having a little connection problem, but there it is, there it is. So that's what the planet really looks like. And this has been dubbed the Anthropocene, which I would rather think of, because it does dominate the planet, is the Urbanocene. That is, cities dominate. And you'll see that's a theme that I will return to very shortly. And just to give a sense of that, that looks like a blank screen. What it is my estimate of what a photograph taken by a NASA satellite would have looked like in the year 1840. So 50 years, so to speak, after the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And if you look carefully, you will see a little bit of light there. But 100 years later, you can begin to see lights and so on, the night lights of cities. These are night lights of cities. That 1940 I chose because it happens to be the year I was born. And that's what it looked like in the year I was born. In the short period of time since then, that's what it looks like. That's what it looks like today. And you know what that is? That is, I said, the night lights of cities and the extraordinary amount of urbanization that has taken place in this very short period of time. But what you may not truly appreciate is what that really is the planet burning, because all of those night lights are being fueled by fossil fuel. That is the surface of the Earth. So this is actually the surface of the Earth burning. And only, I think, a kind of thoughtless person would not conclude that clearly the atmosphere must be heating up and it must be changing the climate. It's a no-brainer. You don't have to be a physicist or a climatologist or a geologist to know this kind of phenomenon, this extraordinary phenomenon that's taken place over such a short period of time would have these very deleterious effects. So just to give some numbers to what's going on, if you just average from now to sort of mid-century, we are urbanizing on this planet somewhere between 1 and 2 million people every week. And what that means is that every few weeks, we are effectively adding the equivalent to a New York metropolitan area of about 50 million people to the planet, or a country the size of Denmark every week, or a city the size of Santa Fe twice a day. That's what's happening as we speak. So this is an enormous effect. And that is, of course, all reflected in this graph, which some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, which is the growth of the world's population beginning back 10,000 BC, where we sort of were emerging from being hunter-gatherers, where we started to develop language, beginning to invent agriculture, and beginning to form very slowly sedentary communities, meaning communities that are static, and that led to cities. And you can see what's happened since for the last more than 11,000 years. There's just been this very slow, gradual increase in the population. And then suddenly, I don't know if you can see my pointer, in this almost suddenly beginning not so very long ago, meaning the Industrial Revolution, about just over 200 years ago, we've shot straight up. And we've gone through almost a discontinuous transition. And you can see, going back to those numbers, I was born here, and and since then, look what's happened. It's gone from about 2 billion people all the way up to we're now almost 8 billion. And that is truly extraordinary. Of course, every metric you want to measure about the planet, whether on the left, you don't have time to really look at these in detail, but it's just to give an impression. You see that whether they're socioeconomic metrics like GDP or energy use, or even paper production is there, water, or on the right, so-called Earth system metrics like the amount of carbon dioxide, the surface temperature, and so on. All of these have gone up in a similar fashion, like these kind of hockey sticks. And this is sometimes referred to as the Great Acceleration. So although I think most of us are familiar with the idea that we live in an exponentially expanding physical universe, cosmologically, most of us don't realize that actually here on the planet, we're living in something that's actually faster than exponential in terms of our socioeconomic universe. That is the things I just showed you. Now, many of you have heard of this man, but probably most of you haven't. John von Neumann, who has probably influenced your life more than most other human beings. John von Neumann was one of the great scientists of the 20th century, a great mathematical physicist. He was, for those that listened to the lecture last month by Jack Schlachter, his delightful lecture on Jewish physicists at the Manhattan Project, he mentioned von Neumann, and he mentioned in passing that he was considered the most brilliant of all the scientists there. And indeed, he may have been the most brilliant scientist in some metrics of the whole 20th century. He was a remarkable man. Just say a couple of words about him. And because this is a Jewish series, he was Jewish. His family was, his father was a well-known banker in Budapest. That's where he was born. He was so successful that he was raised, so to speak, to the aristocracy. And this von Neumann, John, or Janos, as he was then called, took on eventually the von. I think he was the only one of his family that actually took von Neumann, added the von, and he changed his name when he moved to the United States to John, and he went to Princeton, and he's had, and his great contributions range from everything from, without von Neumann, we would not be able to have this kind of conversation, the whole architecture of computers, modern architecture of computers, the way, in fact, we think about computation is due to von Neumann. The things called game theory, which underlies much of modern economics and social sciences, was developed by von Neumann. The foundations of quantum mechanics, von Neumann, and many, many other things. Interestingly, just while we're on an ethnic theme, he converted to Catholicism, when his father died, as all his other siblings did. And even though, curiously, throughout his life, I think almost all his friends were Jewish, and one of his great hobbies was Jewish jokes, which he told in Yiddish. He spoke Yiddish as well as, and by the way, he was a child prodigy. He could speak and read and recite Greek by age 6. So he was quite a brilliant man. He stayed, despite this fascination with Jewish jokes and even Jewish culture, he took confession when he died, and he died sadly very young. So, a remarkable man. But in 1953, he made this astonishing comment: "The ever-accelerating progress of technology gives the appearance of approaching some essential singularity in the history of the race beyond which human affairs as we know them could not continue." Punct. That's pretty amazing, and it sounds in some ways very modern. What is curious about this, he never really elaborated on everything he did. He sort of mathematized, he put into mathematics, made theories and models, but this is one thing he didn't. And in some very modest way, the rest of this talk is trying to put some flesh on the sort of skeletal piece of this statement. And if this is true, if it's what he says is true, would be what I want to call the mother of all tipping points, this fantastic discontinuity. And I want to explore that just to begin with. And I want to talk about what tipping points and singularities, he used the word singularity, and this is the one mini technical piece of the talk. You're all familiar with tipping points and transitions and so, because when water freezes to ice, it's the same stuff, but it's very different. And here's an example of that. That's called a phase transition. And here's an example. This is propane gas. And what you see, what's plotted here on the vertical axis is something called the specific heat or heat capacity. And it just means how much heat do you need to raise a gram of propane by 1 degree. That's all. And so you plot that versus the increase in temperature along here. And you can see it goes very gradual, and then it zooms, goes straight up. And if you keep heating it, boink, it turns into a gas, changes. Still propane, but it changes. Something completely changes. That's a singularity. It's almost going to infinity up here. And it's called sometimes, technically a phase transition, colloquially a tipping point. So there it is. And what you immediately recognize is that this looks just like this. So that's the question. Are we at this major singularity or tipping point suggested by von Neumann? That's what I'm going to talk about a bit. So what I've already said intimated that the future of the planet and whether we're going to go through a tipping point or not is very much bound up with our cities, because we've urbanized the planet basically. And I want to talk a little bit about cities. When you think of the word city, this is sort of what is conjured up. It's infrastructure, the buildings, the roads, and the electrical lines and telephone lines, all things you can't see. But it's very much its physicality. And indeed, that is what a city is. But this is really what a city is, that this is just a stage or backdrop in order to facilitate social interaction, to bring people together and do things like this. This is a picture of New York from about 150 years ago. And this is what a city does. It brings people together in order to create wealth, to create ideas, to innovate, to form social interactions. And here's another picture, another one. And great cities have places like this. Great cities have both informal places like this, squares and plazas and parks, but also, of course, offices and lecture halls and sports stadiums and so on and so forth, to bring people together to do what they're doing here. And I'll come back to this, but of course, you know what's going on here. And I'm going to formalize it a little bit. A is talking to B, and B is talking to C, and C talks back to A, and we build on each other, sort of positive feedback, and we're creating ideas all the time as we sit around talking and informally. We're building ideas. Of course, almost all of those ideas are irrelevant and pointless to anybody else, and they disappear and so on. But what is extraordinary, the spirit of what's going on here or here produces not only great commerce and great ideas, produces the theory of relativity or quantum mechanics. It produces a Google, it produces a Microsoft, it produces an Amazon, it produces a Toyota, and so on. That's what a city does. It's this most extraordinary machine we've ever developed because it facilitates wealth creation, knowledge, innovation, and ideas in order to increase the standards of quality of life for everyone. That's the idea. But, the big but, it also creates problems. And I'm a physicist, and the most fundamental law of the universe is the second law of thermodynamics, which says if you do the kinds of things I just talked about, if you create order, for instance, you make a car, you make a cell, you build an iPhone, you necessarily create disorder as well. And that's called entropy. And necessarily when we do these kinds of things, and we create wealth, we create entropy. And that's what this is. So inevitably, may not be these specific things, we inevitably create this kind of phenomenon. And the challenge is you can't get rid of these, some version of these, but you need to minimize them and see why, and not end up with situations like this or like this. And that's the challenge. Okay. So the science behind what we normally do when we think about these extraordinary problems and challenges that we have when we think of cities and societies and so forth, is we have all these multiple components, and this is just arbitrary, sort of a laundry list. And what we do is put boxes around them, and we treat each one sort of independently, but we go much further than that. We put boxes within the things within those boxes, and within those boxes, we put other boxes. We more and more deconstruct, and reduce them to individual problems, which we then try to solve individualistically. And by and large, in many ways, that's been very successful and has led to many of the things that we enjoy in our quality and standard of life. But what we often forget and do not recognize that, in fact, all of these are interrelated and interdependent, and even more importantly, each one is evolving and changing and adapting. Each one is what we call technically a complex adaptive system. They're highly complex, they're changing due to the changing conditions, but they're all coupled and interrelated. They're not independent, and the whole thing is a complex adaptive system of complex adaptive systems, which is extraordinarily daunting. So had we understood and recognized the inextricable interdependence between these things, we should not have been surprised that some diddly random mutation of a virus in Wuhan, China, would result in no football in Spain, Hertz going bankrupt, no flour in the United Kingdom, social unrest in the United Kingdom, and these are just some minor, and so much more that we've all just been through across the globe, and all of this happened within a few months. So what is extraordinary is that we didn't realize, believe it or not, that football in Spain is actually connected somehow to Hertz rental car and is connected to the production of flour in the United Kingdom. Of course, it's extremely weakly connected, and most of the time you don't have to care about it, but you have to remember it is connected. It's connected now, it was connected before the pandemic, and it was connected very much. It was enhanced during the pandemic, and it is a kind of example of something that's called the butterfly effect. It comes out of something some of you may be familiar with or read about, chaos theory, meaning that a tiny little perturbation over here has huge effect, exponentiated effect far away. And the classic example that's often been given is a butterfly flaps its wings on the coast of Brazil, and it causes a hurricane in Florida. That's called the butterfly effect. And this was the pandemic we've been through is the mother of all of those. It's been extraordinary. So we all have this problem of unintended consequences. So here's a little silly cartoon. So we're all familiar with this kind of situation. And of course, then you focus on the road and you widen it. And of course, we get back to where we were. And that's because you haven't thought about the fact that it's a systemic problem. This is interconnected with so many other things. And that's going to be a theme throughout what I'm going to be talking about. So let's go back to cities more generally. They are these complex adaptive systems. And in the biggest picture, they're made up of two parts, which I've already intimated. One is their physicality, the buildings and the roads and the sort of the energy being flowed, the metabolism, all their infrastructure. There's that part. And then there's the part that is the real part of the city, which is us, our interactions, the information we exchange between us. It's sort of our genomics, and that leads to our innovation and all the wonderful things that we have as a result of that. And it is the integration and tension between these two things that is what a city really is, and what we saw in those pictures, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But all of those things happen through networks of various kinds, and those you're familiar with. Here are typical infrastructural networks, transport systems, and electrical lines, and so on and so forth. And I want to focus down for a moment on the one in the bottom left-hand corner. It's the highway system of the United States, which is sort of a jumbled mess. It just tries to reach everywhere, but it doesn't seem to have much regularity. But here's something interesting. If you focus on one place, in particular, port is a good place to focus. And for arbitrary reasons, I focused on Laredo, Texas. And you ask, you just take over 1 year, you just follow all the traffic that leaves Laredo going everywhere else in the United States. And you just count that, and then you make a diagram of it. This is what it looks like. So the thickness of those lines represents the density of traffic. So obviously it's very dense as everything comes out of Laredo along this interstate, no doubt, and then it spreads out, and some of it ends up here in Santa Fe, and so on, but it goes out. Now, of course, you look at that, and that's much more regular. It has this kind of self-similar, repetitive behavior, and it reminds you, I'm sure, immediately of organisms, of a tree, or of, in fact, you. And in fact, biology is replete with such networks. There is a tree up in the top left, and of course, there you are in the middle there with your circulatory system. And down on the left, just so you know, that's your brain, the white to gray matter in the brain, your lungs. These are two little microcosms, microorganisms, and so on. But it's everywhere in biology, it's networks and the flows. And as I say, there's a great similarity. So I'm going to talk about biology very briefly and tell you a little bit about these networks. So here's what's amazing about these networks in biology. If you put them into mathematics, the principles of these networks into mathematics and physics, you can derive mathematically something that's quite surprising and quite extraordinary given what we're talking about, and that is this. It's called a scaling law, and this is for the most fundamental quantity of your life, your metabolic rate, which is how much food you eat a day, and it's plotted versus size for a whole bunch of animals. And what you see, and it's plotted in a way that some of you may again be familiar with, others maybe not so much, is plotted so-called logarithmically, meaning that it doesn't go up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it goes up by factors of 10 in both directions. If you try to plot it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it would, I think you need a piece of graph paper the size almost of Santa Fe to get the mouse and the elephant on the same graph. But so this is plotted so you can get everybody on the same graph. And what you see is, and this is the prediction, is that straight line. A very simple, everyone conforms to this straight line. Now, this is, why do I say it's extraordinary? It's because each one of these organisms, each one of these animals has evolved by natural selection, Darwinian natural selection, evolutionary pressures, but with their own unique evolutionary history. Not only each organism, but each part of the organism, each organ, each cell type, each genome, and so on, each part of it has its own unique history. So everything is historically contingent. So you might have, the most naive kind of suggestion would be that the points would lie sort of all over the graph, in various parts of the graph, reflecting that evolutionary history. Their individuality would have dominated. But in fact, they all line up on this graph. And this is, by the way, for metabolism, metabolic rate, which is probably the most complex process in the universe, that is making life out of matter. So here it is. The other thing about this line, this is the prediction from the networks. This line, the slope of this line is predicted to be 3/4 down the bottom here, which is less than 1, which means that the bigger you are, the less you need per gram of your tissue or per cell. That is, because this is less than 1, your cells are working systematically and predictably less harder than your dog's, but your horse is working even less hard. So this is called sublinear scaling, and that less energy per cell being used, the bigger you are, is called an economy of scale. And this law was known a long time, and it was called, you see down the bottom there, Kleiber's law. It was discovered just by doing the data, taking the data in the early 30s. And I've also plotted on this, I think the next graph, what it would be if the slope were 1, which is linear, which is what in the most naive sense you would expect, namely that if you doubled the size of an animal, something that's twice the size, you have twice as many cells, you think you need twice as much food since you have twice as much biomass to feed. No, there's this economy of scale, you only need about 75% as much. So there's this great systematic economy of scale, the bigger you are. Okay. So it turns out this was just for metabolic rate, but it turns out almost anything that you measure about the physiology of organisms or their life history, if you plot them in this way, this logarithmic way going by factors of 10, they look the same. And not only that, the slopes of them, like that one being 3/4, are multiples of 1/4. And here's an example. Here's heart rates. This is heart rate, and the slope of that is minus, because it's going down, 1/4. There it is. And you see, you know, a mouse beats, heart beats very fast, and a horse's beats much slower. And the smallest mammal, a shrew, beats about 1,000 times a minute. And a whale, which is down the end of this graph, beats systematically and predictably at something like, I forget, just only a few beats per minute. So I'm going to digress very slightly. Here's another scaling law for lifespan. Now, there's much more, you see there's much more variance and fluctuations here. But this is lifespan versus size. So this is how long you live. I'm sorry, it's a bit busy. I apologize for that. But I want to focus just on mammals there. And you can see the slope. I'm sorry, I left this in a technical form. The slope of this line is almost exactly, the fit to this line is almost exactly 1/4. And here's the point. Here's the point I want to emphasize here. This is decreasing with a 1/4 slope. This is increasing with a 1/4 slope. If you multiply this times this, the decrease of 1 with a 1/4 and the increase of another 1/4 cancel out. So if you multiply heart rate times lifespan, it doesn't depend on size. But what is heart rate times lifespan? Is the number of heartbeats in a lifetime. So what this says is that the number of heartbeats in a lifetime is the same for everybody, so to speak, every mammal. And so down here, the smallest mammal, that shrew beating 1,000 times a minute for only a couple of years, has the same number of heartbeats as that whale that lives 125 years and is beating very slowly. So if you look through the right lens, namely heartbeats, everybody lives the same length of time. All animals, all mammals live roughly the same. So it's a rescaling of the way you look at things. Okay, and that's permeates all of life. We're all scaled exactly, so to speak, as we should be, obeying the mathematics and physics of these networks. I'm going to do one more example in biology before turning it over to cities and the globe, and that is growth. We've all gone through this. We've all scaled, so to speak, scaled up, and this is how you did it. You ate, you metabolized, you then sent that metabolic energy through your networks. It goes to the cells. At the cellular level, it maintains the cells. It repairs damage and replaces ones that have died. And then it adds new cells, new growth. And you can put this into mathematics. And this arrow, so to speak, is that network supplying the cells and so forth. And when you do that, you derive that solid line there. This is for us as a rat, and that you derive that for your growth curve. This is the same thing that, you know, when you go, if you have children, you go to the pediatrician with your baby. I suppose they still do it. They give you a growth curve where your baby should sit at various months. Here it is for baby rats, and that solid line is a prediction from this theory based on what I just said, and there's the data points. And here's the point that I want to emphasize, not just that the theory works, but that the reason you stop growing is actually related to the sublinear economy of scaling of metabolic rate that was driving this. The fact that metabolic rate, you're supplying less and less energy the bigger you are to the cell, and cells are growing faster and faster. You can't keep up and you stop. And that leads to bounded growth. That's why you stop. And The fact that you stop and you live most of your life, you meaning most organisms, is a major component of why the biosphere is so sustainable, why it's been around for 2 to 3 billion years. There's this extraordinary meta-stability, even though it's, of course, continually evolving and adapting to the biosphere. Okay, and we'll come back to this. And just to show you, this is true for many, lots of other animals. And again, to do what I did, I'm sorry about this, but to do what I did for death, this is for growth. If you rescale, I'm not going to explain the symbols. If you rescale the size and you rescale the time in a clever way that the theory tells you, then everybody grows in the same way. And there's just a short list of animals, and they fit on this line. And the theory tells you what this line is. We all fit on this universal growth curve. There we are. So if you look in the right way, we're all growing, dying, developing in the same way. Because we're all rescaled versions of one another. And just to add to that, true of tumors too, because tumors are you, and here's the gray dots, the gray things up here. All these gray things are the data from this graph, from animals, and the colored ones are tumors. So you see, they sit on it, they bear too. And this is actually a possible window onto understanding something about the growth of solid tumors and even devising ways to address them. Anyway, that's not the point of this talk. So here's just a quick summary of what I said in biology about life, biological life. We're dominated by these predictable scaling laws with this 1/4 power, this number 4 being the universal spiritual number that controls the biosphere around you, the entire biosphere around you. It expresses an economy of scale. The bigger you are, the less you need per capita. I called it sublinear. The pace of life systematically slows the bigger you are. Hearts beat slower. Animals live longer. And growth is sigmoidal. That's just the technical way of saying you grow quickly and then stop, and then you die. And that's all can be explained by the mathematics and physics of these networks. Okay, question. Is this true of the social systems and organizations we have been man-made? Cities, companies, universities. The only thing I'm going to talk about here is cities. And do they express or manifest some sense of this kind of universality that I showed for cities with this 1/4 power scaling? Okay, well, they are networks. We've already talked about that. Cities are networks. So maybe there are analogs to these hidden laws of biology for hidden laws of cities. And indeed there are. Here's a mundane one. This is the number of petrol stations, gas stations. We called it petrol because I did this work. The 2 people I did it with were in Europe. And you see, it looks like biology. This is what is plotted here in the same way, logarithmically. On the vertical axis is the number of petrol stations. On the horizontal axis is the population of the city, the size of the city. And you can see it looks quite similar. And the dotted line is linear, so it's sublinear, which means there's an economy of scale. The bigger you are, the bigger the city, the less gas stations systematically you need per capita for the city. And you can see this is 4 European nations, and roughly speaking, the slopes of these lines are all the same. What is fascinating is that this is true around the globe. If you look in Latin America, China, Japan, everywhere that we can get data, it looks the same way with the same slope for gasoline stations. And the slope of that, the only difference with biology is the slope is 0.85 instead of 0.75. So you have a 15% rather than kind of a 25% savings. But what is even more amazing is that this is true for all infrastructure, not just the silly old gas stations, but it's true for the length of all the roads, the length of electrical lines, and so on, the gas lines, the buildings, and so on. The bigger you are in terms of a city, the less infrastructure you need. The bigger the city, the more efficient it is. And that has big consequences. If that's the infrastructure with this 15% savings, that means the bigger you are, the less entropy, the less carbon, for example, it would suggest is being produced per capita. And I'm not going to explain this. I mean, this is just showing you that it's a nice scaling graph. This is carbon emissions in cities, in American cities, as a function of size. And you can just see, I'm sorry, I left it in the technical form. This is the slope here. It's less than 1. And the only point about that is that what it says in English is New York is the greenest city in the United States because the amount of carbon being produced per capita is less. And one of the worst would be a place like Santa Fe. The carbon production is one of the highest. And as you get smaller and smaller per capita, that's because you're getting less and less efficient. So there's something extraordinary about that. So purely, from this purely materialistic environmental viewpoint, the bigger the city, the better in that sense. Now, as I said earlier, in a certain sense, that's the uninteresting part of the city. It's physicality. That's the stage, the theater upon which we play out our lives. And our lives are to do with social networks in that city. The whole point of a city, the only reason we have cities is to facilitate and enhance social interactions. And this is a traditional picture of a social network. And for those not familiar, the nodes are people and the lines are just joining them. Friends, this person here obviously has an enormous number of friends. This is more like me. I only have 1 or 2. I'm a bit of a recluse. Here it is, or maybe this. Maybe I have more than that. That's quite extreme. Maybe here, 1 or 2. That's me. But here they are. This network. But this is sort of topological. There's 2 points I want to emphasize about social networks, and it's emphasized by this cartoon. And that is, there's a modularity to the network. It's not just individuals. We form groups, particularly families, but groups and divisions and departments and so on. And we form us, and there's a sort of regularity to that. But also, what's emphasized here is we're not sort of like this in cyberspace somewhere. We're always on a 2-dimensional surface. You have to be in the kitchen, in your office, sitting on the toilet. Somewhere we have to be when we're communicating. I mean, it's not we're not sort of somewhere up inside. Even if we use cell phones, and here I'm on the internet connecting to you, I have to be in my office, sitting in a place, and you're sitting in a place. And so what that says in terms of what I've been developing is that the social network has to be tied to the physical network. They're totally interrelated and interacting. And that's what this picture is. I've shown you all these pictures before. What's in the middle there is a combination of those 2 things. And that's what really life is about, is the interface and intention between, as I say, the social networks on the bottom and the physical networks on the top. And something I should have said, not only do you have to be in one place, you have to be able to move from one place to the other, because you have to be able to go take the kids to school, go to your office, go to the store, go to the theater, whatever. So there's also movement involved. And I won't have time to explore much of that, but it'll come in. But here's the point, going back to that picture in the middle and what I talked about, that positive feedback, continually building on each other, even though most of it might seem pointless and useless to everybody else, does produce this great society and the great things we are fortunate to participate in. That positive feedback, building on each other, leads, instead of sublinear scaling, the bigger you are, the less per capita, it leads to something called superlinear scaling. The bigger you are, the more per capita. And instead of the pace of life slowing down, the pace of life inextricably increases. And here's the data. This is metrics from different socioeconomic metrics from around the globe. Just a panel of 6. I could show you, 50 or 75 of these damn things. but you can see them here. They're very, very varied, everything from wages in the top left, patents, this is ideas. And what is plotted here, those are plotted on the vertical axis, and the horizontal axis is the size of the city. This is wages in the US. This is ideas created in the city in the US. This is fancy restaurants in Holland. This is crime in Japan. And what you see by eye, they all scale in the same way. They're different parts of the world, and they're different metrics. Some are things we like and some things we don't like, but they look all the same. And what is interesting, all of them have pretty much the same slope, 1.15. And what does that mean in English? It says the good, the bad, and the ugly all come together in a similar way across the globe. If you double the size of a city, or look at a city twice the size of another within an urban system, then systematically, as is already said, you save approximately 15% on all infrastructure. And at the same time, you gain 15%, you get 15% more wealth, income, all the good things, ideas, patents, education, creativity generally, interactions, but you also get by 15% as much crime, more disease, flu, and so on, and more COVID, all by about 15%. And just to give you some numbers, a city of 10 million will have double the number of COVID cases in half the time a city of 100,000 will. It's much faster. Everything is much faster. And even though it's only 100 times bigger, it has 200 times as many cases. So in times of COVID, you don't want to be in a big city. You want to be in a Santa Fe or Boise, Idaho, or somewhere. So that's great. But otherwise, much better to be in a big city. If you want a job opportunity and excitement and a sexy life, lots of people, interactions, more theater, more culture, and so on, better to be in a big city. And that's why, as we were just discussing earlier, before we came on, you have to leave Santa Fe every once in a while or go to New York or London. Okay, so onward. So there it is. And this is a theory. It's not completely developed yet. I have to say it's still a work in progress. But one of the things, one of the things about doing science is not only putting these things together, having theories, putting them into mathematics, making predictions, checking them against data, and so on. But that's crucial. Crucial to better do that, make predictions. And one of the predictions of this would be, look, if I could measure the degree of social interaction in a city versus its size, measure how many times people are interacting with each other, it should scale just like this, because I'm saying all of this is derived from social interactions. Well, up until recently, that was extremely difficult to do. But now it's very easy, because all of us carry a little detector that's keeping tabs on where we are and who we're talking to, because almost everybody now carries a silly little cell phone or mobile phone. And we were able, with our friends and colleagues at MIT, to get hold of billions and billions of telephone calls from various places, some data, enormous amounts of data. And we were able to analyze that data and measure the social connectivity as a function of size. And there it is. And you see it just by eye. It looks exactly the same as those things as predicted. And those two colors, one is, I think the blue is the United Kingdom, and the greenish is Portugal. One of the things we did, this is just a slight tangential comment, is we also measured, among many other things, the number of friends of your friends. So your group, what's your sort of little social group that you generally interact with. And whereas the number of your social interactions increases systematically and predictably with city size, the number of your connections, your group, your little clustering remains the same. And this top one here, I don't know if you can see this, this is Portugal, and this is the United Kingdom, and you see it doesn't change. And this goes from a small town of 10,000 people to Lisbon, which is over 1 million. And so even though you're interacting with more people, your clustering, your sort of little module is pretty much the same as it is in a small town, even if you live in New York. And the only amusing thing about this graph, you see the clustering is much greater in Portugal than in England. England is barely above, because as you almost certainly know, no one talks to one another in England. Okay, so one of the questions that you might ask, and I think is totally open to speculation, is what happens now with this, not what we're doing now, this really soulless, two-dimensional, horrible, inhumane way in which we're interacting. So I can't see any of you. Well, I can see Ron and Bonnie. What happens that more and more of this happening? How does that affect things in terms of this idea of connecting place with information exchange? And I don't know the answer to that. We can discuss it maybe afterwards. The other thing I mentioned is that the pace of life increases rather than decrease. That was the graph I showed you before of heart rates decreasing. This is an amusing, whimsical one. This is the speed of walking versus city size, and predictably it increases. This is ancient data actually, but this is measuring walking speed. You can see it does as predicted. I'm going to miss this out because I'm running late, and I was going to talk about things like inequality and so on, but I'm going to move ahead and try to extend this this idea to the entire planet as a whole, and get to this question that I started with about its sustainability, and this whole question of tipping points and singularities, and where we might be going. And all of the stuff, in a certain sense, was background to that. So here it is. So can we treat the planet as a whole, and can we derive, as I did before, is there a sort of an equation and a unified theory that we can develop to address the extraordinary challenges that we're facing in the coming years? So I want to go back. I'm going to go backwards first to just elaborate a little bit on your biological metabolic rate. And, it was implied, this is the rate at which you use energy, and it's the amount of food you eat per day. And what I actually plotted here, which I showed you earlier, is actually called the basal metabolic rate, because it's the amount of food you need to just stay alive. So as if you were sleeping. And that's what's plotted here. But of course, what you eat per day also has to go towards your activity. And that's called active or filled metabolic rate. And this is approximately 2 to 3 times your basal metabolic rate. So you have about 2 to 3 times more two times more goes into moving around. 50 to 100% more goes to moving around. And that's true for all animals. So there it is there. There's the graph I showed, and that red line is just sort of shifts it up by a factor here. Let's see, here we were, and you go up, that's by a factor of about 3. And that's great, and that's sort of interesting, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But before doing so, some of you may have noticed something that, if you're not familiar with, is kind of a real eye-opener. I had this graph, but look where you are on your basal rate, just staying alive, man and woman, and you go across. It's less than 100 watts. That's all you need to stay alive, 100 watts. And guess what? Not a joke. That's 2,000 food calories a day. Your 2,000 food calories a day is a bloody light bulb. All you require to stay alive is the energy of that stupid incandescent light bulb. You are unbelievably efficient. Natural selection has been extraordinarily efficient in producing your metabolism. You are that's all you need. Now, what about your active rate? Well, in the natural state, you see down in red at the bottom, it was about, instead of 100 watts, you need 200 to 300 watts. And there are still people on this planet, in the Amazon and Borneo, that live but pretty much at that rate as hunter-gatherers. But in fact, our social metabolic, I'm going to call So the terminology changes here. The active metabolic rate for modern human beings, us, we who live in this kind of unnatural state in houses and cities and so on, called metabolic, social metabolic rate. And for the planet as a whole and per capita, this is what we participate in. We have to maintain the system as it is, which means we've got to maintain all the buildings that we live in and work in. We have to, so we have to have all that being maintained. We have to maintain all the individuals. We have to have doctors and hospitals, and all of that goes in, and that's sort of our basal social metabolic rate. And then you add to it all our active social metabolic rate, which is our moving around and our developing new ideas and new products and forming new institutions, creating more wealth. So there's a direct, simple analog between biological metabolic rate and social metabolic rate. And if you add that up, that's what we had a moment ago. If you add that up, that's where we were as hunter-gatherers till 10,000 years ago and started forming communities and cities. That's where we are now. And this is logarithmic, so this number is in excess of 10,000. It's gone up by a factor of 100. We've gone from about 90 watts to 11,000 watts if you live in the United States, and it's true of most of Europe, which is extraordinary, 100 times bigger. And you saw there, and I emphasized this, or at least I mentioned it earlier, you see we fit exactly where we're supposed to fit as a biologically. And in fact, if I showed you 50 other biological scaling graphs with human beings on it, we fit exactly where we should in terms of the length of our aorta, how long we live, how many children we have, and blah, blah, blah. Now we've completely violated it by going off by a factor of 100 up there in doing the wonderful things that we've done. And you can ask yourself, how big actually are you? How big is an animal with a metabolic rate of 11,000 watts, which is what everyone listening to this is? You are about 30,000 kilograms. You're not 150 pounds or 75 kilos. You're about 30,000 kilograms, which is about 30 tons. Each one of us is 30 tons. And there are 7.5 billion, almost 8 billion people on this planet, all of whom want to be like, have some kind of quality and standard of life like us, and they want to be like this. It's loony. How can we do it? There's another metric. We're 12 elephants, just so you know. So just think of that as you go around. Okay, so let's move on and try to finish this up. What is the time evolution, the growth of the planet? So it's the same equation as we had before, translated to the entire planet as a sort of unified organism. It's a very gross feature, very gross averaging. So that social metabolic rate gets, as I said a moment ago, gets allocated between maintaining what we already have and growing new stuff, including new ideas and so on and so forth, new companies, blah, blah, blah. And you have to put that into mathematics. And I call this whimsically the master Anthropocene equation. And that equation, when we applied it to biology, which we saw, I'm just emphasizing the point, looked like this. It led to bounded growth. It had sublinear scaling driving it. It led to bounded growth. And I said at the time that leads to extraordinary stability of the entire system. And that's why it's been around for 2 to 3 billion years. But that's terrible in our present paradigm of what economies and should be like. We're supposed to be open-ended. I mean, that's the whole, since we discovered capitalism, entrepreneurship, and exploited fossil fuels, which led to the planet burning up, we've demanded open-ended growth. Presidents run into trouble in the United States, not just that they don't have that the growth rate decreases from 3 or 4% to 1%, but people forget that 1% still means exponential growth. It may be slower, but it's still exponential, and that's not what this is. This is stopping. here's what's great about the theory. The good news is that super linear scaling leads to super exponential growth for cities or economies. So, which is great. So the theory is really very satisfying. Just to remind you, it's driven by social interactions. Social interactions have positive feedback. Positive feedback leads to superlinear scaling. Superlinear scaling leads to open-ended exponential, faster than exponential growth, which is what we have participated in for the last 200 years since the Industrial Revolution. This is fantastic and wonderful. And indeed, you can see it is just for some cities, and even the dips and bumps can be explained by this theory. I'm not going into it, but we have open-ended growth, which is what we love and try to promote. But there's a catch, and that catch is given by that dotted line, which is called a finite time singularity in mathematics. And what it means is that in some finite time, as is indicated here, and that time is indicated by that, you can see that symbol there, T with a little c as a subscript. In some finite time, this socioeconomic quantity that I plotted here is going to become infinite. It could be the GDP, could be the number of AIDS cases, could be the number of restaurants. It has to become infinite if you just continue, which is crazy. Obviously, can't do that. It's nuts. And the theory tells you what happens. Theory tells you, I've done it right. Oh, there, I said it there. If you go beyond the singularity, you collapse. Not such good news. So that's terrible. And this is by the way, it's obvious, this is the trajectory we've been on. I showed you the population growth earlier and all those metrics. So how do you avoid that? Or put it slightly differently, how did we avoid that so far? And this is how we avoided it, is we recognized that this, and this is sort of a cartoon of it all, just plotting one of these socioeconomic metrics versus time, that as you've gone along growing here, you have a certain cultural paradigm that's sort of reigns pretty fixed. I mean, to go way back, you discovered stone, you used stone or iron or bronze. That's why we say the Stone Age, the Bronze Age. It sort of defines the time. And then we have the Industrial Revolution, coal and steel dominating. Now, more recently, computers dominating. And most very recently, IT, completely dominating the culture. It dominates the globe. So what you realize is that one way of avoiding the singularity, instead of collapsing, is somewhere before you reach the singularity, you better make a major innovation, a major change. You better reinvent yourself in order to start over again. And then you can go off. So you switch from computers to the internet. That's a big switch, and you start over again. And of course, you'd hit another singularity. So you have to do something else. You have to have another paradigm shift or major innovation. Reinvent yourself again and again and again. And so there's a kind of theorem that if you demand unbounded growth, which we have, and we do, it requires continuous cycles of innovation to avoid collapse. Well, people have been saying things like that for a long time. The new thing is that you have to do it faster and faster. Time speeds up. That's what the theory says. The time to go from here to here is inextricably, predictably, quantitatively shorter than the time from here to here than it was from here to here, and so on. Things have to come faster and faster. They accelerate. Life accelerates. Here's another way of expressing it. This is from a man named Ray Kurzweil, who has promoted the idea of singularity, but in a completely different context. His idea of a singularity is we're going to reach the promised land of cyberspace and AI and so on, which may be, but this is what he concocted. This is not mine. And what you see, it's a little complicated, but I think you can get it. Plotted along here is how long ago something happened. So life began 3 times 10 to the 9th or more, which is 3 billion or more years ago. And it took, this is 10 to the 9th, which is a billion, more than 1 billion years to develop. And so it is with all these things. And then gradually when you come here, it all happens at once on this scale. So a computer happened, just a few years, or 20, 30 years before the present. And it took only 20, 30, if you go across here, 20, 30 years ago. So it's a way of putting it all on one graph. And the theory predicts this line. The theory I just described to you is effectively that red line. Okay, I'm not going to miss this out. So I want to finish up with one last thing to emphasize it. If you take this theory and develop it, I'm sorry, there's a teeny bit of mathematics here, and you ask, how do I approach this singularity? So let me swing back. Whoops, sorry. What is the approach to that singularity? What is the mathematical form of how I get to that singularity at what I call the time t sub c? So what the theory says is if I plot, I call it y with the t, some socioeconomic metric, could be the GDP or the amount of energy used, and you plot it versus the time to the singularity. So how long is it to the next singularity? You plot that. This is what the theory predicts. It says you should get a straight line, and it tells you the slope of that line. So it's quite powerful. And here's the data from 1975 to the present. Now, I got to point out one thing that's slightly peculiar. This is this TC minus T. That's the singularity. That's the present time. So as time increases, this is getting smaller. So time increasing is actually this way because of this minus sign. So this is 2008, and this is 1975. And if you take the data on energy use of the planet, it's predicted that if you plot it this way, there should be a nice straight line. And you see it, it's great. But here's what we learned, which was amazing to us. We were surprised that if you look from 1950 to 1975, it's still a beautiful straight line as predicted, but it changes slope. This slope is predicted, but we didn't realize that there was a break in mid-70s. This is energy use, and it's reflected in everything else. There is the same thing in water use, and I can show you others. So we actually have avoided some weird tipping point about 40 years ago. And it leads to speculation. What was happening? Well, the two major things that were happening in the mid-70s were the first, and it was an enormous impact, the gasoline crisis, the petrol crisis, when OPEC stepped in for the first time and we were starved of fuel. And at the same time, we began globalization. The globalization of the planet economically began, and the big thing to globalize the planet, which is, of course, now controversial, but that's what it was, and it changed, and you can see it on this graph. And let's see what's next. Oh, yeah. So I can show you others. Here's actually stock market data and so on. But I'm going to finish here and just say that this is very much work in progress. It's not complete, hasn't been completely published yet. But we are leading to a singularity. And there's another one coming, and that's coming up beyond this graph because time is going backwards. It comes up here. And you can estimate when that is. And there's lots of variance in it, but it could be as soon as 15 to 20 years, could be as much as 40 or more years, but it's happening. And if we don't meet with that, the system will collapse. And in the way I showed you a moment ago. So this is an answer to von Neumann. So just to sort of summarize what I said in this last part, this unbounded growth, which we love, we prospered from, leads to a singularity and potential collapse unless we innovate faster and faster. There is a myth which is the dominant paradigm of economics, that the way we get out of these problems is to innovate. Yes, we do, but we don't solve the problem, we postpone the problem. This says that all you're doing is postponing, and in fact, it's making it even more challenging because you have to go faster and faster. And this is the example of the accelerating pace of all life. And it's also something that is something to speculate about. Socioeconomic life is getting faster and faster, but we are all the same people, the same brain, the same biology as we were when we started this 10,000 years ago, stopped being hunter-gatherers. In fact, we're the same as we were 100,000 years ago, the same brains effectively and bodies. But we have to adapt to the new iPhone 14 or AI or machine learning, big data, and all the things that keep coming faster and faster at us. And there's a point at which it's going to be harder and harder for us to adapt. And just now I'm going to stop being a scientist and speculate. I believe this increasing pace of life is something that's producing enormous collective anxiety. And I will jump ahead and say, I think that induces looking for very simple solutions, which induces the acceptance of authoritarian rule. It's open, it's a speculation. So here's who we are. We're Sisyphus. We're pushing a boulder up the mountain. You remember he was condemned to push the boulder up the mountain, and it rolls down again, and he has to push it up and down for eternity. And he did it, by the way, because he was king, and he was arrogant and disobeyed the gods, and he had to do this. And we're much worse than Sisyphus. Sisyphus just had to, it rolled down, and he had to push it up at the same rate each time. Ours is that it rolls down faster each time, and we have to push it up faster each time. And eventually, we're going to run into a socioeconomic heart attack. So I think we need a new paradigm, something that's more integrated, something that is big picture, systemic, quantitative coupling, and we have to couple it with all these marvelous things like lots of data, machine learning, and AI. And we can't do it mindlessly, which is what is happening a lot, and we have to have a framework to do it. So I'm going to finish there, and I'm just going to do two things. I want to tell you that even though I've talked about I and occasionally we, these are the group of people, these wonderful group of people that were my collaborators. Most of these people did all the real work. My major collaborator was this wonderful ecologist, biologist, Jim Brown, who was president of the American Ecological Society when I met him. Two things I want to make about this. It's an eclectic group. They come from different subjects. There's physicists, mathematicians, chemists, biologists, ecologists, and so forth. But the second part, and also they're quite a bit ethnically diverse. And you can ask me the question, this is definitely something I shouldn't say. Anyone Jewish here? Or this one? These are the ones on the sociology. My main collaborator was Luis, who is now the director of the Monsanto Institute at the University of Chicago, and all these lovely people. And here's the recent postdocs. Vicky is now a young professor at the Sloan School of Business at MIT. Hei Jin, she's Chinese. Hei Jin is Korean and is a professor at the Northwestern Kellogg School of Business, and so on and so forth. Carlo Ratti is a mad, very famous architect. And these are some of the senior people I first collaborated with who did none of the work. All these people did the work. And I'll finish up with the ones that are working on this latest part on the singularity. These three younger people, and they're all great and wonderful. And finally, these are the people that supported me, including some of you that are Santa Feans may have known Jean and Claire Thor, who were extraordinarily generous in supporting my work and the Santa Fe Institute. And finally, oh yes, I had one last thing. I'm sorry, I'm going on too long. I had a couple of Jewish quotes going back to von Neumann. Here's a Jewish quote, Bob Dylan. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. Can gather round people wherever you roam and admit that the war, I can't sing it. and admit that the waters around you have grown, and accept it that soon you'll be drenched to the bone. If your time to you is worth saving, and you better start swimming or you'll sink like a stone. All together now, for the times they are a-changing. And here's a quote from Midrash, make my father happy, who's been dead for 50 years almost. See it that you do not spoil and destroy my world, for if you do, there will be no one else to repair it. And that feeds into something we're all familiar with. If you're Jewish, tikkun olam, fundamental to being Jewish, repair the world. And the last shameless thing is, if you want to read about it, you can read my book. There it is. Bunk. So sorry, I finished. Sorry. No more. No, thank you.
Wow. Thank you. This has been incredible, is continuing to be incredible. And
I do apologize.
Geoffrey was fascinating.
we have a number of questions here. Let's see if we can get to some of these. So looking at the city world, the Urbicine development and the future of food production, where is it going to happen, or how is it going to happen?
Well, I think food production per se, I'm not an expert in this. I'm certainly not no expert in agribusiness and agriculture and so on. There was, of course, the famous Green Revolution by Borlaug in the 70s, when I'm sure some of you that have followed this are familiar with, if you go back to the 70s, when the whole question of the exponential increase of population reared its head again under Paul Ehrlich and the population bomb and something called the Club of Rome. And so this is a cautionary note. Ehrlich, I think, said that India's population, I probably have the numbers wrong, India's population will never be able to exceed about 350 million. It's now 1.3 billion. So that was a terrible mistake, and so on. And he didn't take into account, and this has always been the argument against people who argue that against people who question sustainability, is the argument was that Ehrlich did not take into account innovation, which is true, he didn't, which is surprising. Similarly, with the Club of Rome, which was a group of businessmen that got together in Europe to address this question, and they funded a big program at MIT, and that was a little more substantive, I would say, but they also didn't take into account. And in fact, the whole question of this feeding, this very same question, came up at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution under Thomas Malthus, who said, there's no way we can be feeding the extraordinary increase that was already happening at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century because of the stimulation of the Industrial Revolution. And his argument was that we have exponential increase in population, but the agriculture will only increase linearly. We just do the same old thing. And again, he was dismissed. He was dismissed by leading economists, famous economists at the time, and has been ever since. And in fact, Malthusian has become a dirty word among such economists, because it said, you didn't take into account innovation, and we'll just innovate our way out. And indeed, going back to what I said about the 70s and Borlaug, he did. He had the Green Revolution, and it sort of saved us. And I suspect something like that can continue, but the whole question of things like water, which is not, which is fundamental in clean water, is crucial. And whether we can really, here we are, we in Santa Fe are very sensitive to that, and the whole question of the Colorado River and the Rio Grande and so on. And that's going to become a bigger and bigger issue, I think, is the question of water. And so I'm not I'm not confident that we can keep up because of that, although without being having expertise in it, I suspect there will be enough innovation in agriculture. It may not be the kinds of things we want, including fiddling around with genes and so on, that we can potentially keep up. But the dynamic I'm talking about is sort of outside of that. It's something that's deeper than that, because it's to do with fundamentally who we are as human beings and our social nature and how we interact with each other.
Yeah. Thank you for mentioning that, because you actually are helping us make the transition to mention next month, Tariq Abu Hamid is going to be the director of the Arava Institute in the Negev, is going to be here speaking particularly about sustainability in that region of the world in terms of water and agriculture, and also the added issue of trust. That it's water and it's agriculture, but there's also the political, cultural dynamic that runs parallel to it. So that'll be interesting. There's a question here. Hallie Faust is asking about the prediction about population growth, and he mentioned that there are demographic suggestions and evidence that with certain situations, rising rates of women's education means falling rates of fertility. So his question is, could that affect the slope? So I mean, how does that falling rates of fertility with rising education, how would that affect the slope that you have mentioned?
Yes, very good question, and one we've thought about. So in fact, when I finished my talk, I had some slides at the end with questions in mind, and this is one of them. And I had actually the data on fertility. And interestingly enough, this is just a bit of side comment, first of all, to that. If fertility scales with the size of the organism, but it scales with metabolic rate. That is, the higher the metabolic rate among animals, I'm talking about just among animals, the lower the fertility rate. That's why, whales have very few calves, and, mice have lots and lots of offspring. And we're supposed to have, in our natural state, we would have 10 to 12. We're supposed to have 10 to 12 children. But with the increase of our social, if you interpret metabolic rate as social metabolic rate, and you follow the decrease of fertility that was referred to in the question, as the increase of social metabolic rate has developed from the mid, I guess the data begins in the mid-19th century, all the way through to present, it follows exactly the predictions of the scaling. And it's very hard to understand mechanistically why that is happening. When we first came across this, it was a real puzzle, and it still is a puzzle, because you might have thought that the more money you have, the more wealth you have, and that was originally an idea, more children you have, but in fact, it's gone the other way. And of course, one of the reasons you wanted more children, two reasons. If you were an aristocrat, you wanted sort of your power to go forward, I guess. But for most people, it was to have, workers in the field, because most people were agricultural, or people to help you, and so on. That has changed. But, and of course, the invention of contraception has aided this enormously, that we can intervene, and this has gone down. So now go more directly to the question. Yes, it does, and the fertility rates are going down. And in the more developed countries, as I'm sure most people know, many of them we're not reproducing, we're not self-reproducing anymore. The average reproduction rate is less than 2. Nevertheless, the world population is growing exponentially, and part of the future direction of some of the work that we're doing is, in fact, to look at this more seriously, in more detail, to try to answer this question. I put it on the back burner because the time scale of the issues that we're facing, the challenges in terms of this language of singularity, are the immediate decades, 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And the change of fertility rates are not as fast as that. So it's a secondary problem. That is, in the long term, that might save us, but unfortunately, we've already started on the slippery slope. So it's still an open question, and it will certainly mitigate the problem as the decrease in fertility rate, but it's not fast enough. The simple calculations that we've already done is simply not fast enough to keep up with the rate at which the system, so to speak, is eroding.
Okay, all right. Paul Golding has a question that about Dennis Meadows' work from the early from the 70s, the limits of growth work,
right.
And he's saying it sounds like you agree with him, at least with the reaching of the same endpoint. But how would you compare your work to what he did?
Yeah, so I should have mentioned his name, Dennis Meadows, because when I said the Club of Rome, it was in fact the person at MIT was Dennis Meadows, and who sort of did who carried out the whole program, and they did a lot of how should I say, simulations they tried to do of what the future would look like in terms of the economic growth and this whole kind of Malthusian challenge, and indeed came to very similar conclusions. It's quite different. There wasn't, Meadows was trying to take present data and then have some relatively simple models of what it would, projecting it into the future without, I don't know how to say it, a theory or a mechanistic theory as to what's actually happening that's producing this. And so I came to it much more as a physicist who wants to sort of dig down deeper to what the principles are and what are the underlying dynamics in order to derive the equations that tell you how the system is progressing and growing. And that's what I tried to show you at the end there in the entire planet, for showing you what the evolution of the planet is looking like and showing that it leads to these singularities, something that was not part of Meadows' work at all. On the other hand, as Paul intimated, the sort of basic conclusion of the challenge, of this Malthusian challenge, is not being met. I mean, that is the challenge.
Yeah.
Still, what Malthus, even though Malthus was wrong, Paul Ehrlich was wrong, and I would even say what Meadows did was sort of wrong in a technical way. The conclusions have all been the same. It's that the timescales are quite different.
Ron, do we have time for one more question?
Let's take another question. Yes.
Okay, there's a question here from Jan Cohen, who says the Endangered Species Act came into being in 1973. Oddly, we did not have the foresight to include humans in that act or equation. Could you comment on that, please?
I mean, on the act itself, yes. Well, that's a very interesting way of looking at it, indeed. I mean, it is remarkable that, and in fact, I think that Endangered Species Act was, to some extent, was part of, what was sort of culturally developing in those 70s, which is at the time of the population, the recognition of the population bomb, the resurrecting of Malthusian ideas and the Club of Rome and so forth and so on. And out of that, despite the fact that I think, am I wrong, that I think the Endangered Species Act was actually under the Nixon administration, in fact, that there was this feeling that we need to come to terms with these questions. But I think my speculation is that it all got lost in the post-hippie era and the Vietnam War, and the turning of the country away from more liberal ideas to more conservative ideas. So we lost that. But it is interesting that had that not happened, I suspect what has been asked here might well have happened, that it would have been expanded into more social, collective, human sphere, and recognized that it isn't sort of us sort of versus or with the biosphere. We are part of the biosphere. We should be, we should be included. We too are an animal, and we need to be protected too. And in fact, I suppose part of the motivation for the Endangered Species Act was also self-interest, that there was already ecological recognition that the loss of diversity in ecology is a sign of collapse. And that's typical. I mean, that's, by the way, that's typical of almost any complex system. It's true even of a city or a company, that the less diverse you get, the more vulnerable you become. And so that was part of the motivation then. But it should, and in the future, I think one could imagine at a time when we do expand this and we recognize what the kind of thing I showed you before, that we need to see ourselves in terms of, from my perspective, in terms of these scaling laws, that we are part of that. We are integral to that. And we're all interconnected, and we're all interrelated, and the same dynamics, the same mechanics, the same mathematics is occurring among all animals, all organisms, as well as all human beings, and amazingly among all human social organizations. They have the same thing is occurring. It's all unified. And that, maybe I should finish on this, and that actually is a thread that has run through Jewish thought, I would say, and the idea of one God. I mean, I'm not a religious person, but which unifies, that everything is unified. And I think that is, and at the beginning we said, and I think that's what Spinoza was grappling with in his philosophy, where he sort of rejected the simplistic image of God and saw it as nature. But he saw that as very much I think was stimulated by his Jewish origins.
Right, the unity, yes.
Unity, yes, the unity and universality of all things.
Right, right.
Which I tried to sort of express in this talk.
And you did.
And it came through.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It certainly did.
Geoffrey West, thank you so much for this most fascinating work. And, the thing is that even with reading your book, once seeing you go through these things yourself brings it into another dimension. And thank you for doing that.
Thank you. Sure. Pleasure. Thank you very much for having me, and I appreciate it. Thank you both.
There you go. Just in case it wasn't clear to everybody.
Thank you.
Look.
I'll appoint you my agent.
There you go. Geoffrey, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure for us.
Thank you.